Hey, how's it going everyone? It's Lee Halliday, and in this video we are going to be building something that I called Gist Shameful. It's basically the idea of gists from GitHub, but we're going to do it in React using Firebase. I've already sort of set up a Firebase auth in a previous video that I'll link to below, and in this video we're adding the Firebase Realtime Database to be able to add and edit these shameful gists that I'm creating. So I could go in here and I could define something like demo.rb for Ruby. And maybe what we'll do is we'll say 1.9. We'll convert this to an array. And then we'll map the values, number, end. And we'll just puts, no, we want to return. So we'll do number times 5, whatever. Save that. Come down here and here's my shameful gist. So this is what we're going to be creating in this video. I hope you enjoy it. So to build out this gist shameful application, we're not starting right from scratch in this case. We're starting with Firebase auth already added to the Next.js app that we're working within. So I'll link to a previous video where we set that up, but I'll also include a commit to basically the same starting point here so that we can all be on the same page. I've already logged in, so if I log out, it basically shows me the option to sign in with email, so I'll just do that quickly. Enter in my password there. So we're logged in. Let's take a look at the app and what we're dealing with. So pull this open. We're doing the entire thing in a single page here, and I've got a few imports commented out that we're not yet using, but basically it's this home page that is pulling information about the user. And we're saying if it's loading, just don't show anything yet. If there's not a user, show the Firebase auth form that you saw earlier. And if we get to this point, basically seeing the logout button, that means we're ready to get started building out this just shameful application. So I'm going to start by commenting out all of this. And just below these imports, we're going to basically set up an instance of our database. So const db equals firebase.database, just like that. So if I go back into the browser and go over here to my Firebase console, I've already clicked into Realtime Database and clicked the create database or set up database, whatever it's called. And I just basically did the default settings. So somewhere in the US, doesn't really matter. And I picked the rules that basically allow me to read and write everywhere in this database. And that's one of the things we're going to work on in this app. We're going to build the ability to sort of create gists, sort of like on GitHub, like I showed you earlier. But then we're going to apply rules to our database so that it's secure, so you can only read your own gists. Okay, so first things first, in this application here, we're going to build the ability to create a gist inside of our database. So with our database already set up here, a reference to it, we're going to come and just below the logout button, we're going to call a component called add gist that doesn't yet exist, but that's okay. And to it, we're going to pass the user ID. So I'm going to get that from user.id, which is coming from my useauth hook that's set up. So this is obviously freaking out because I haven't created that component yet. So we're going to define that just here below. So function add gist, it's going to receive the props UID, which we'll just declare inline here with TypeScript, saying that the UID is going to be a string. Just like that. Let's add a few more lines here. Okay, so it's not ID, it's .uid. Perfect, there we go. Thank goodness TypeScript. So it's freaking out right now because we haven't returned anything from this component. So why don't we just make it happy, return a form, just like that. And why don't we add a button? So we'll say button of type submit, and we'll say this is save. So this right here gets our form rendering correctly, doing nothing useful, but that's okay. So what we're going to do is add the two inputs to basically capture, just like when you're creating a gist, the file name and then the actual code. So the first one will be an input of type text. And here's where you need to define what value is it going to display. So for that, we're going to store it in some state. So we're going to say here, const file and set file is equal to use state starting as an empty string. And then we'll set up our code state as well. So set code is equal to use state like this. So with that in place, we can come and we can say the value is going to be the file, and on change, we will get an event, and we will then call set file, passing in the event target value, just like this. And if we were to just do this, we should have an input here. We could add a placeholder maybe. Placeholder is file.extension, just like that. Hey everyone, so I launched a course called Next Level Next.js where we build a full stack Next.js application using GraphQL on both the front end and the back end, TypeScript, Prisma, a whole bunch of cool technologies, Mapbox, Firebase authentication. And head on over to next.leehalliday.com where you can pick it up for $49, or if that's a little bit expensive depending where you're from, click this link here, purchasing power parity, and you can get a coupon code to make it a little bit cheaper. So again, head on over to next.leehalliday.com. I'm very proud of it. Hope you enjoy it. Why don't we just add it in H2 saying add gist here. Looking nice. And we'll come down below this input and we'll add a text area to collect the code. So here we will add text area, close it, and we'll add a value of code. And then on change, we will put in event set code event.target.value. Cool. There we go. It's showing up the ability to add a gist here. And I'm just going to quickly make these required. So just add required to both of them so that if we were to try to submit here, it's not going to allow us. Okay, so what do we want to happen when we submit this form? We want to basically go and add this file to our Firebase database. And we're going to do that inside of the onSubmit event here. So why don't we set this up? We're going to say const onSubmit is going to be an async function, just like that. And so this will be onSubmit. We will just pass the onSubmit function. Remember, don't call the function because that would happen immediately. Pass the function that it will call when this event occurs. And what is this going to receive? It's going to receive the event. And why don't we type it correctly? So it's going to be the form event, and it's a generic that will pass in what type of element. So it's the HTML form element, just like that. Cool. So where does this form event come from? I imported that from React itself. So the first thing we're going to do is prevent default, just so that it doesn't actually submit the information. And then down here below, we need to basically go and send this data to Firebase. So how should the data look like in our Firebase database? Over here on the README that I've committed, I've sort of created a sample of the data that we're going to try to create. And if you were to think about this in like relational data terms, we've sort of got two tables, but remember Firebase is just a big JSON object. But we've got one where we're going to store the gists, and then so each gist, this would be like its ID, will have three values: the code, the file name, and then the ID of the user that added it. So there's gist 1, gist 2. And we're also going to, in a separate one, store something called user gists, which is basically a mapping between the user's ID and the gists that they created. And by storing it this way, it's almost like a join table. If you're used to sort of relational databases, you would have a join table between the users table and the gists table. But it will allow us in Firebase easy lookup for the gists that the user has created, because they don't really have an easy way to query, like, find me all the gists with a matching user ID of my user. It's sort of possible, but it's not great. So by doing it this way, it will work easier. So this is what we're sort of going for here to create this structure. So if we come back here inside the onSubmit function, the first thing we're going to do is basically create a ref to a new gist that we haven't yet sent to Firebase. So we're going to say const gist ref, and it will be the database that we created a reference to up here. And then we're going to create a ref. A ref is sort of like anytime you're talking about a specific part of your database. So we're going to be creating a ref to the gists part of it. And then we're saying we're going to push a new one onto it. So this hasn't saved it in the database yet. It's just sort of created almost like an empty ref to a place that doesn't exist yet. Actually, it might exist. I'm not sure. You could try it if you want, but we'll just keep going. Okay, so with this ref to the new gist, of which we haven't set any values yet in it, we are going to basically take this value and create this record here. So our user ID, and then this gist1, and then we'll say true. It needs to have a value, so we'll just say true. So what we're going to do now is we're going to await for the DB with a ref to user gists slash our user ID, and then slash basically the key of this new gist ref. So gist ref dot key, and we're going to set this value to true. So when this has been added, basically this record here, we can now come back and set the additional information on the gist record itself. So we're going to await that to happen. So we'll say gist ref dot set, oh boy, set, and we're going to set the UID, our user, and then the file and the code. So once those things have been set in our database, and we'll go take a look at what it looks like in a second, we can reset the inputs for our form. So set file to an empty string and set code to an empty string as well. So with this in place, if we fill out this, so we'll call it maybe map.javascript, and we'll come here, this is a little annoying, okay, 1, 2, 3, and we'll map it, and we'll say that it's going to be number times number. So this is our JavaScript here, and we'll save it. So there's no indication that it worked or not on the screen, but we can hop over to our database here and take a look at what it created for us. So inside of our database, we have gists. Here's the gist ref that we created, the one we pushed on, and then the code, file, and user ID. And then here we have the user ID, same one you can see matching here, and then a reference to this gist up here with a value of true. So this is the structure we want for this type of data that we're storing. So with our data in there, what we can do now is come below and basically write code that will render and show the gists on the page. So we're going to come back here, we're going to create another component called gists, and it's going to receive our user ID as well, or UID. So save that, and I could just put it between them. It doesn't matter really where. So I'm going to say function gists. It's going to receive a prop of user ID, which is a string. And why don't I return an empty unordered list? So we can't see anything yet, but it should be showing up here. So the first thing I want to do is basically use the useEffect hook to set up some listeners listening for changes to our Firebase database. So it will only happen up one time, sort of on the first render. So we'll say useEffect to call this function, no dependencies, so it will only ever run once. And in here we want to start listening to basically changes to our database. And the first thing we're going to do is set up a ref that points at this record here. So user gists and then our user ID. And it's going to be listening for new children added to this piece of data right here. So we're going to create a ref, user gists ref, and it's going to be a db.ref pointing at that place I just talked about. So user gists at our user ID. And one thing we need to do is basically track all of the references that we're going to be listening to real-time updates to. Because if this component ever unmounts, we want to tell it to stop listening to those refs. So what we're going to do is create a variable called refs, and we'll start by just putting this user gists ref inside of it. So why are we doing this? Because when this component unmounts, it will run the code, the function that you return from useEffect. So return an arrow function. And in this arrow function, we can basically iterate over each of the refs. So that will be ref. And we can tell the ref off. Basically stop listening for any change. Oops, there we go. Cool. So when our component unmounts, it will stop listening to all of our refs. But we haven't started listening yet. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to take this ref to user gists ref, user gists ref, and we're going to tell it to start listening to when a new child is added. So that will call a function and give us the child. So if we were to look at this data, basically, why don't we console.log the child.key like that. So let's come back here and just open up the inspect tools. Reload this. So here we get the one child that's in here, the mtrd, basically this one here. So once we have this key, what we can basically do is create another listener for each of these children here. So we're going to have one listener listening for new children being added, and then an additional listener for each of those children. So that's why we have an array, because we're going to keep track of all of these. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to put this key into a variable, and we'll make it a string, and that will be equal to child.key. You can see it doesn't like that though, because a key could be string or null. Now we know it's a string because we just console.logged it and we saw it, and it is. So we're just going to say as string here to basically tell TypeScript, no worries, like I got this, it's going to be a string. So with our key in here of each of the children, what we're going to do is push this onto our refs array. Just like, actually no, not yet. We're not pushing yet. First we need to set up a ref to this. So we're going to say db.ref, and that is to gists at the key that we set up, just like this. So once we have the ref to this individual gist, we're going to push this onto our refs array, just ref, like this. And then we're going to start listening for any changes to this individual gist. So we're going to say gist ref.on whenever there's a new value here. So whenever it's added, like on the first time, or whenever it gets edited, it's going to give us a snapshot. And for now, why don't we just console.log the snap value, just like that. So if I were to come look here, here is our one value of the gist. So we listened to the child, and then we started listening to the individual gist. And if we were to add another one, so let's do a map in Ruby. So this would be 123.map num times num. This is how you do a map in Ruby. Save that. You can see here, boom, it got the event child added. And then we basically put that gist in a ref, and then we listened for value changes like that. And so here are our 2 ones. If we were to refresh the page, it's going to instantly start listening to the 2 gists that we have for this user. But we don't want to just console.log it, right? We want to basically take each value and store it in some state somewhere so that we can render that state onto the screen inside of our unordered list. So we're going to come here and we're going to create basically an array of gists. Or it's not array, it's actually going to be an object of gists. And we'll set it to set gists, and it is equal to use state that will start as an empty object. And we're going to get a little bit more specific about the type of data we're storing here. So we're going to go into TypeScript land, and we're going to say that this is going to be a record sort of like an object, where the key is a string and the value is going to be an interface that we're going to declare just above here. So here we can say interface igist is going to have a user ID of a string, a file of a string, and then the code, which is also a string, just like this. So with this in place, whenever we basically get an updated value here from this snapshot event that it's listening to, we want to take this value and put it inside of our state. So we can do that by saying set gists, and we'll do the type where we're basically passing a function where we're going to receive the old value, and we're going to return, and we'll do it long form. So we're going to return a copy of the old, and then we're going to set the updated value on the key, and then its value here is going to be snap.val, just like this. So if we were to console, actually even better, why don't we just put one li with a pre inside and do json.stringify of the gists, null2. Okay. So if we were to come back here, so we load the page, it's empty for a sec till it populates its value. And here's gist1, and then below we have gist2. So now basically our job is just to render these in a nice way. So I'm going to delete that. And because it's an object and not an array, you can't straight map an object. You basically need to say object.entries of the gists. And that's going to give you an array back where each element is a tuple, so 2 in this case. And the first one is the key, and then the next one is the value. So remember what each of ours looks like. The first, the key is a string, and then the value is an igist that looks like this. So just delete that. So we're going to map those. And we'll do that here where we're mapping, and our response is a list item. So what we're getting is the, we're going to call it the ID and then the gist itself. So we need a key on this list item. So we'll use the ID for that. And then why don't we just come in here and add an H3 where we show the gist.file. So if I were to save this, come and look. So now we're showing the 2 files we have. Perfect. And then below that, I want to basically use a syntax highlighter. So I'm importing React syntax highlighter, and it gives me a component up here like this. So I'm just going to go down below the H3, and I'm going to use the syntax highlighter. And so the way this works is basically inside of here, we want to put the gist.code. And we need to, actually we don't have to do anything. We could come, refresh the page. There we go. There we go. So there we go. So there's our JavaScript map, and there's our Ruby map below. So there's a couple things we could do if we want. We could apply a different theme to this syntax highlighter. So we do that by saying that the style is style. And how did that work? I had an import up here where I'm importing Atom1 Dark as style from this location in the package. So if I just go back down, now we have stylized code, which is starting to look good, but it doesn't quite yet know of the language yet. So if we wanted to, we could basically parse out the extension of the file and then determine the language from that so that we can highlight it correctly. Why don't we try to do that quickly? So I'm going to set the language, and I'm going to create a little function called getLanguage where we'll pass in the gist.file. And I'm going to declare this just above here, function getLanguage. So it's going to receive a file which is a string. It should return a string. And I'm going to set up a quick little lookup table. So const langs is equal to, and we'll say JS is JavaScript, RB is Ruby. So you could add the other langs here if you want. And just to keep TypeScript happy, actually I'll show you the error and then we'll look at how to fix it. So what we're going to do is take the parts of the file, so split on the period, like this. And then we'll get the last one, and that's the extension. So we'll say parts at the length of parts -1 to get the last one. And then what we'll do is we'll return the langs at the extension. Or if it can't find one, we'll just say text as like a fallback here. So you can see TypeScript isn't happy because element has an any, because it doesn't work. There's no index signature with a parameter of type string. Basically, what we need to do is come in here and say that it's going to be a record where the key is a string and the value is a string as well. So that allows us to look up a value with a string and return it. Oh, get function. That should be called getLanguage. Cool. So with that in place, it's hard to really even see. Why don't we console.log this out? Actually, we'll just paste it in here. Make sure it's pulling the correct value. It's not. So getLanguage should return. What did I screw up? GetLanguage langs. Let's console.log the extension. All right, some nice troubleshooting. So we are getting the correct thing. Why don't we see if this is working? Yeah. So we're returning langs or text. Let's make sure that's working. Yeah, there's the langs. So why is this not working? Language here. I don't know. Let's just put it above. Yeah, there we go. Let's inspect components, syntax highlighter, Ruby. Yeah, it is working. I don't know, whatever the colors are, it just happens to look the same. So let's just forget it and keep moving like that. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do, because we now have it adding, showing, I want to quickly add edit, which is actually pretty easy to do. And I'm going to, inside of this gists function, create some state, which will keep track of which one we're editing, because we only want to edit one at a time. So editing and set editing, which will be equal to an empty string, like that. So this state here, we are going to come and add a button that will be saying edit. So type button on click. What we're going to do is set the editing to be equal to the ID, like that. So now we have an edit, and when you click it, it changes the editing value. So what we want to do is, instead of just showing whatever's inside this li, what we're going to do is like wrap this in a ternary, where we say if the ID is equal to editing, then what we want to do is either show an editing form, which we'll create in a second, or we're going to put a fragment like this, and we're basically going to pop all of this inside of the fragment. Cool. So if we just go and take a look, edit, it's editing the second one, now it's editing the first one. Obviously it looks like garbage, so we need to create an actual form here. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to create one called edit gist, where we're going to pass in the ID, we're going to pass in the gist itself, and we're going to pass in a function to call when you want to basically stop editing. So to stop editing, we basically just set editing back to an empty string like that. So we need to create the edit gist function. And to do that, I am actually going to copy the add gist, the entire thing, go below, and we're just going to tweak it slightly. So we're going to change it to edit gist. It will receive the ID, the gist, and a close function. So we need to update our type signature. So the ID is a string, gist is an igist, and close is a function that returns nothing, so void. So what we can do now is our two pieces of state, instead of starting as an empty string, we can say that the file is gist.file and the code is gist.code. And basically this can stay the same, except we don't need to show an h2 anymore. Just like that. So if we were to come quickly, click edit, you can see it now shows an edit form, or we can edit the second one instead. The last thing we need to change is basically what happens on submit. So on submit, I don't want to add a new gist, so we'll replace that right here. What I basically want to do is get a reference to the existing gist. So gist ref is equal to, it lives in gist/ID. And then what we want to do is say, okay, reference to the entire gist, go into the file field and set it equal to the file value in our state. And then we'll do the same thing for our code. Set code. And when that's done, we just want to call the close function like that. So if we were to come here, let's just refresh to set everything up again. So I could come here and I could say edit this. Let's call this mapping.js and let's say it's number +1. Save that. So it updated here and it updated here. And what actually happened is as soon as we basically updated the value in Firebase, way up here, this listener for value changes to a gist would have triggered, which would have updated our state and then re-rendered the gists that we're displaying. So functionality wise, we're all done here. We can add gists, show them, edit them, but it's wide open. Basically anybody can read anybody's gists, change them, all of that stuff. So we need to take advantage that our user is authenticated and go into the real-time database rules and define rules so that you can only read and write to your own gists, not anybody else's. So I've got right here sort of wide open rules. Anybody can read, anybody can write. So why don't I just pop both these over to false, like that, publish them. And if I were to come back here and refresh the page, it won't be able to load any of my gists because it's completely blocked off right now. And so what we can do is basically come inside of the rules here and start sort of shaping how the rules look, matching to what our data structure looks like. So what I mean by that is basically we've got gists like this, and we also have user gists like this. So that's sort of what our data structure looks like. And we'll start down here in user gists because it's a little bit simpler. So what we're going to do is inside of user gists, basically the first value you're going to find in here are the different user IDs, the UIDs. And because that's dynamic, we can't hard code somebody's user ID. So we're going to define a variable. So $UID to represent the user's ID. And then we're going to define read and write rules for this level of data. So read rules, what are we going to have? We're going to basically allow reading if the UID is triple equals to the auth.uid. So whichever user is authenticated. So you're sort of writing JavaScript inside of a string here, which is a little bit funky, but that's the way you do it. And we'll define a .write. So same thing, if the user ID is triple equals to the UID here. So this will allow us to read and write which gists our user has created. But we also wanted to find some rules here for the gists themselves. So remember, inside of gist, the first key here would be the gist ID. So we're going to define GID like this in a $sign to represent a variable. And then inside of here, we're going to say read some rules and .write some rules. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. Read's not so bad. What we're going to say is basically we want the auth user ID to be triple equal to, and what do we want it to be equal to? We're going to access the data, so whatever gist data is there. We're going to access a child field, and specifically the UID, and we're going to get its val. So basically, you can read gists where the UID is equal to who you're authenticated as. Now the write, I'm going to hit enter here, and there's going to be two sort of options. Option 1 is going to be in these brackets, or option 2, just down here like that. So option 1 will be for basically new records that haven't been added yet. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say if it is not data.exists, like this. And so remember, this is a new record. So we're going to want to say, and the auth.uid is triple equal to the new data.child UID of, and its val. So there's data, which is the existing data that's already there, but because our data does not exist yet, we're going to look at the new data that's being added. So there's always new data and then data, which is the existing. So, or we're going to say the data exists and the auth.uid is triple equal to the data child of UID and its value, like this. So we're going to publish. Hopefully I didn't mess up any of the rules. And remember, I'm going to put these rules, if they're not already there, inside of the README. So I believe I already added them, but I did them a little bit differently now than I had them before. So we'll paste that in and save it. So we're going to come back, refresh the page, and ideally it should be able to load our data. We should be able to edit it. So map, and we'll change this back to num times num. Okay, looks good. And we'll just define like something dumb. I don't know. What dumb do we want to do? Name.javascript, const name is equal to Lee, like that. And there we go. So it pops it down here on the end. Const name is equal to Lee. So that's how you define rules around your database to ensure that only the people that should have access to the data have access. And if we were just pop back here, here's what our data structure looks like. Again, we have our 3 gists, and then for my user ID, the 3 records that I've created. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and yeah, check out Realtime Database. It's a really cool functionality to work with, but you have to think about your data structure quite a bit differently than I'm used to personally with relational database. All right, take care. Bye.